Nobody turns them on. There is no staff member who arrives early, unlocks a side door, walks through the corridors, and flips a switch. A timer does it. The lights simply come on, the way they have come on every morning for 11 years, illuminating the photographs that line the eastern wall of the main gallery. Men in hard hats, arc welders throwing white light into darkness, blast furnaces lit from within like small suns. The faces of workers who understood, in a way that is difficult to articulate to someone who has never stood inside a working steel mill, that what they were doing was not simply manufacturing. It was the physical expression of a country's belief in its own productive capacity. The museum sits 400 meters from where the furnaces used to be. The furnaces are gone. On a Tuesday morning in early March, a facilities manager named Donna arrived at the museum at 7:49, 11 minutes before the lights came on automatically, the way she had arrived every Tuesday for 8 years. She was 54 years old. Her father had worked the blast furnace at the original Bethlehem plant for 27 years. She had grown up understanding steel the way children grow up understanding the language spoken at the dinner table, not as an abstraction, not as an economic category, but as the texture of daily life. The smell of it, the sound of it, the particular pride of a man who comes home with his hands marked by the work. She unlocked the side door. She walked through the corridors. She sat at her desk and opened her computer. There was an email from the museum's funding coordinator in Albany. She read it twice. Then she pushed back from her desk and looked at the wall of photographs for a long time without speaking, because what the email described had not arrived without warning. The warning had been written. It had been assembled by people whose professional obligation was to assemble exactly this kind of warning, to gather the data, to model the consequences, to put the numbers in sequence and attach them to a document and place that document in front of the people with the authority to act on it before the consequences became irreversible. The document had been placed. It had not been read. 3 weeks later, 19 American industries went silent. This is the story of the memo that was never read and the silence that followed. The document was formally titled the Bilateral Industrial Dependency Assessment, Internal Classification Level 2, prepared by a joint analytical team operating across the Department of Commerce, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, and the National Economic Council. It was 41 pages long. It had taken 63 working days to produce. It contained the modeling output of 4 separate economic simulation systems, cross-referenced against 11 years of bilateral trade data, and it arrived on the desk of the relevant senior policy coordinator on a Friday afternoon at 4:17. It was logged as received. It was not opened. Not that afternoon. Not over the weekend. Not in the 3 weeks that followed, during which the policy decisions it had been produced to inform were made, announced, and implemented without reference to a single one of its 41 pages. The document's central finding was not complicated. It did not require specialized training to understand. It did not arrive wrapped in the kind of academic language that gives policymakers permission to set a document aside on the grounds that it requires further translation. It was written, deliberately and at the specific instruction of the team's senior analyst, in the plainest English that the findings permitted. The finding was this. Of the 23 industrial sectors currently operating under the proposed new tariff and trade restriction framework, 19 had supply chain dependencies on either Canadian inputs, Mexican intermediate goods, or both, at levels exceeding 40% of total production requirements. 40%. Not a marginal exposure. Not a manageable disruption buffer. 40%, which in the language of industrial supply chain modeling sits well above the threshold at which a sustained disruption produces not a slowdown, but a halt. The document used the word halt. It used it deliberately. It used it 11 times across 41 pages, in 11 different sectoral analyses, applied to 11 different industries, each with its own dependency map, its own timeline to disruption, and its own estimate of the workforce directly affected. The total workforce figure, aggregated across all 19 affected sectors, appeared in the executive summary on page 2. 4,312,000 workers. Page 2. Never read. To understand what 40% dependency means in practice, you need to understand what it does not mean. It does not mean that 40% of a factory's output is at risk. It means that 40% of the inputs required to produce 100% of the output are sourced from a supply chain that has been placed in legal and commercial jeopardy by the policy framework being implemented without reference to the document sitting unopened on a coordinator's desk in Washington. Remove 40% of the inputs from a production process and you do not get 60% of the output. You get zero, because industrial production is not a proportional equation. It is a dependent sequence. Every stage requires the completion of the stage before it. A steel component that cannot be finished because the alloy input from a Canadian supplier has been disrupted does not produce 60% of a finished part. It produces a component that sits on a factory floor at 40% completion and cannot move forward. And a component that cannot move forward stops the line that depends on it. And a line that stops takes with it every worker, every shift, every downstream process that was waiting for what that line produces. This is what the memo modeled. This is what the memo described. This is what the memo attempted to place in front of the people who needed to read it before the framework was implemented. The framework was implemented on a Monday. The memo had been on the desk since the previous Friday. 72 hours. The distance between the warning and the consequence was 72 hours and 41 pages that no one opened. The first industry to go silent was residential construction. Not because residential construction is the most exposed sector in the dependency model. It is not. It sits at position 7 in the memo's sectoral ranking by vulnerability. But it was the first to go silent because it operates on the thinnest inventory buffer of any major industrial sector in the American economy. A home builder does not stockpile 6 months of lumber. A home builder orders lumber 4 to 6 weeks ahead of need, because lumber is bulky, because storage is expensive, because the just-in-time model that has governed American industrial logistics since the early 1990s was optimized for a world in which supply chains do not stop. Canadian softwood lumber supplies 31% of American residential construction timber requirements. This figure has been contested, negotiated, tariffed, and litigated for 4 consecutive decades. It has never, in 4 consecutive decades, actually changed in any meaningful structural sense, because the mills that produce the lumber are in British Columbia and Quebec. Because the forests they draw from have been harvested and replanted on cycles calibrated to American demand for 60 years. Because the infrastructure, the roads, the rail lines, the port facilities, the grading and treatment capacity has been built around a bilateral relationship that predates every living person currently working in the sector on either side of the border. When the new framework suspended the existing lumber agreement and imposed a 47% emergency tariff on Canadian softwood, effective the Monday morning of implementation, the home builders did not immediately go silent. They had 4 to 6 weeks of inventory. They went silent 5 weeks later. To the day, his name is Victor. He is 61 years old, a master electrician with 34 years of licensed practice, the last 19 of them running his own 3-man electrical contracting firm outside Raleigh, North Carolina. He has wired 411 homes. He knows this number precisely because he has kept a ledger since the first year he went independent, a brown cloth-covered accounting book he buys from the same office supply store in Garner, and in which he records every project, every address, every square footage, every completion date. His wife calls it his book of houses. He calls it his retirement plan. Victor had 7 projects contracted for the spring season, framing already up on 4 of them. Electrical rough-in scheduled to begin on the first Monday of April. He arrived at the first site at 7 in the morning. The framing was there. The foundation was there. The site was ready. The lumber for the interior wall framing, which had been scheduled for delivery the previous Thursday, had not arrived. The builder's site manager was on the phone when Victor pulled up. He was still on the phone 40 minutes later. He was talking to a supplier in Charlotte, who was talking to a distributor in Virginia, who was waiting for a callback from a mill in British Columbia that had suspended American shipments pending legal clarification of the new tariff classification. Victor sat in his truck for 40 minutes. Then he drove to the second site. The same conversation was happening there. He called his wife from the third site parking lot. He told her that the book of houses was going to have a gap in it this spring. She asked him how long a gap. He said he did not know yet. He said it depended on things that were above his level. She asked him what things. He said he would explain it tonight. He drove home. He had not pulled a single wire. By the end of the 3rd week, the silence had spread through the 19 sectors in the sequence the memo had predicted, in the order the memo had predicted, at approximately the pace the memo had predicted, with one exception. The memo had estimated that the automotive sector, which the document ranked as the 3rd most vulnerable due to its dependency on Canadian-sourced aluminum, precision steel stampings, and electronic control module components, would begin showing production disruption signals in week 4 to week 6 of the framework's implementation. The automotive sector began showing production disruption signals in week 2, 11 days ahead of the memo's most aggressive modeling scenario. The reason was not complicated. It was the reason that is always the reason when a model underestimates the speed of an industrial disruption. The model had assumed that companies would draw down existing inventory before signaling distress. The companies did not draw down existing inventory. The companies, upon receiving legal notification of the new framework on the Monday morning of implementation, immediately suspended all purchase orders for affected components pending legal review of their exposure under the new tariff classification. They did not wait to see what their inventory could cover. They stopped ordering. When companies stop ordering, suppliers stop shipping. When suppliers stop shipping, production lines stop running. When production lines stop running, workers go home. In the automotive sector, across Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, 6,400 workers went home in the second week of the framework's implementation. Not laid off, not terminated. Sent home on temporary production suspension, which is the industrial language for a situation that everyone in the room understands may not be temporary, but which no one is prepared to describe in the language it actually deserves until the legal and political picture becomes clearer. The legal and political picture did not become clearer in week 2. It did not become clearer in week 3. In week 3, the other 16 sectors that the memo had identified reached the disruption thresholds their respective dependency models had projected, one by one, in sequence. In the order the 41 pages had described, in the plain English that had been chosen deliberately so that the document would not require translation. 19 industries, silent. Henry Paulson, who served as Treasury Secretary of the United States during the 2008 financial crisis, a man who spent the most acute weeks of that crisis making decisions in real time that affected the savings, the employment, and the economic security of 300 million Americans, gave a series of lectures at the University of Chicago in the years following his tenure in which he returned repeatedly to a single observation about institutional failure. He said that the failure mode he feared most was not the failure that arrives without warning. The failure that arrives without warning is a crisis. A crisis, however devastating, has a clear before and a clear after. The country knows what happened. The country can build the response around the shared understanding of the event. The failure mode he feared most was the failure that was warned about, in writing, in advance, with specificity and precision, by the people whose job it was to do exactly that warning, and that proceeded anyway because the document was not read. Because that failure, he said, does not have a clean before and after. It has a before and a during, and a very long, very expensive, very contested period of afterward, in which the question of what was known, and when it was known, and by whom it was known, and why it was not acted upon, becomes a permanent feature of the political landscape, absorbing institutional energy that should be directed at recovery, and directing it instead at attribution. He was not speaking about industrial supply chains. He was speaking about mortgage-backed securities in 2006 and 2007. He might as well have been describing a 41-page document that sat unopened on a desk in Washington for 72 hours, while the policy it was produced to inform was implemented without it. The principle is the same principle. It is always the same principle. The document was eventually read, not in the 72 hours before implementation, not in the first week of the framework's operation, when the disruption signals were already appearing in the residential construction sector and the purchase order suspensions were already moving through the automotive supply chain. It was read in week 4, after a congressional subcommittee requested its production under a formal information disclosure process. A staff member read it aloud into the record of the subcommittee hearing. The room was quiet through most of the reading. When the staff member reached page 2 and read aloud the executive summary's central figure, 4,312,000 workers in 19 sectors at disruption risk, a senator from Ohio asked that the sentence be repeated. It was repeated. The senator asked when the document had been delivered to the policy coordinator's office. The answer was provided. The senator asked when the framework had been implemented. The answer was provided. The senator did not ask another question for several minutes. He looked at the table in front of him, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand not intellectually, but morally, trying to locate in himself the appropriate response to information that sits outside the categories his experience has prepared him for. Then he said quietly, for the record, the 8 words that would be repeated in 11 languages, quoted in the editorials of 23 newspapers across 4 continents, and entered into the permanent congressional record of the 119th United States Congress. 8 words. The warning was written. Nobody chose to read it. Then Donna, in the Bethlehem Steel Heritage Museum in Lackawanna, New York, eventually responded to the email from the funding coordinator in Albany. The funding disruption it described was real. The timeline was tight. The implications for the museum's spring programming were significant in ways that would require difficult conversations with the board and with the community organizations that had scheduled events in the main gallery through June. She responded professionally. She outlined the options. She proposed a meeting for the following week. Then she turned back to the wall of photographs. The men in hard hats, the arc welders, the blast furnaces lit from within like small suns, the faces of workers who understood that what they were doing was not simply manufacturing. She had given tours to school groups in this gallery for 8 years. She had watched children look at those photographs with the particular expression that children wear when they are trying to understand something that existed before them, something that they can see the shape of but cannot fully feel, the way you can see the shape of a sound without hearing it. She always told the school groups the same thing at the end of the tour. She told them that the men in those photographs did not lose their industry because the work stopped being necessary. The work was still necessary. Steel was still necessary. The industrial capacity those furnaces represented was still necessary. They lost it because the decisions made in rooms far from those furnaces were made without the knowledge that the people closest to the furnaces carried. Without the memo, as it were. Without the 41 pages. Without the warning that was written and never read. She would add that now. She would add it to every tour, for every school group, for as long as she was standing in that gallery with those photographs on the wall and the automated lights coming on at 8 in the morning, and the furnaces 400 meters away, reduced to a heritage site, a place where the past is preserved precisely because it was not preserved when preservation was still possible. The warning was written. Nobody chose to read it. 8 words for the congressional record. 8 words that traveled through 11 languages and 23 editorial pages and settled, finally, into the permanent and unambiguous record of what this period produced. Not a crisis without warning. A crisis despite warning. A silence across 19 industries that had been described in plain English on page 2 of a 41-page document, 3 weeks before the silence arrived. The silence was not inevitable. It was chosen, not by malice, not by design, but by the particular and catastrophic casualness of a decision-making culture that had come to believe that the velocity of action was itself a form of strength, and that the documents produced by the people whose job is to slow that velocity down long enough to read 41 pages were, in some fundamental sense, optional. They are never optional. The memo is never optional. The 41 pages that describe what happens next are the only thing standing between the decision and the silence. 19 industries learned that in 3 weeks. 4,312,000 workers learned it with them. The warning was written. Nobody chose to read it. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.